Morning Blues, Daniel Childs here for Friday the 14th of February 2025. Happy Valentine's Day for those who celebrate. Today's show, we're going to be looking ahead to tonight's game at the AMEX Stadium. Chelsea travelling once again to Brighton, hopefully with a much better outcome than we got in the FA Cup last Saturday. It's a huge game in Chelsea's season. They kind of all feel huge at the moment, particularly because the form has been so bad. There's been such little time for Chelsea to settle down into a nice rhythm again. Will this be the start of that rhythm? But obviously, the whole striker issue is a huge question mark, not only on this game, but moving forward for Enzo Maresca. So please do like, subscribe. For those who always ask about Morning Blues, yes, I have had my coffee this morning, so feeling a little bit more caffeinated and a little bit more alive for today's show. Obviously, it's a little bit of a mix of kind of a chatty Morning Blues show, which is what we do here on Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays, but then also my team selector. So the reason I couldn't do it yesterday was I had a root canal. The interesting thing, people always make a joke about how bad root canals are, and I have to say, watching Robert Sanchez or having a root canal, I have to say it's a bit of a difficult one to kind of assess which is actually the more favourable one. Hopefully we won't be seeing Robert Sanchez in goal. I've had this conversation with several people, and it's a shame that, as having a show about Chelsea Football Club, you want to sit here and be positive, right? Like, I was thinking back to when I was making shows whilst we were winning the Champions League, and even earlier in the season, like when we were winning games. And you don't want to be repetitive. You don't want to come onto every show and say the same thing. But I think it's very difficult at the moment, whenever we're having a conversation about Chelsea, to not fall into that, because you kind of are constantly left with the same assessment, which is dull, which is a little bit boring, but I think it needs to be said and it needs to be hammered home about who's responsible for this failure, and kind of why reflecting that mood, that frustration amongst supporters is valuable and I think important. I don't think we should creep back into a state of just accepting the current situation, that it's all fine, it's all dandy. Like, listen, you spend as much as Chelsea have over the past 4 or 5 transfer windows and you don't succeed that radically, that's entirely acceptable. I don't think it is. But this game in particular, obviously there are some new things to talk about. So in terms of team news, we obviously know the striker situation is the biggest question mark. Nicolas Jackson ruled out till April. It's a huge blow. I think that, yes, Jackson has looked shot and Jackson has been pretty poor in front of goal since about mid-December, hasn't he? The last goal he scored was the one against Brentford, which at the time felt like a huge goal in Chelsea season in a positive way. That feels like a different season. That doesn't even feel like this season. But since then, he has completely, his form has gone off a cliff. But my concern with Jackson not being there is not only because there's no suitable backup. Marc Guiu is obviously injured as well. But there's so much that Jackson does in his game. Like, even in this bad run, there has been moments where his build-up, his link-up, I specifically think about the Bournemouth game, but other games too, where he makes runs, he makes decisions. I think he's a good conduit at times for other players to excel. And I just also think just the way Chelsea play, and we saw this last season, right? Jackson, whether he should be in that position or not, like, I don't think it's a coincidence sometimes when Jackson hasn't been in the team, how much is lacking in terms of movement, pressing, energy, work rate up top. How do you replace that? And because Nkunku performed so poorly at Brighton last Saturday, a lot of people probably don't have the stomach to see that again. But I've got an interesting solution. I think it's a pretty obvious one, to be honest, and I think it was one that most coaches would go for at the current time. So we'll go into that. The quotes and the narrative that has already come out and the reaction since that Jackson injury. I saw Matt Law wrote a piece, and it was an opinion piece. It wasn't just a report. It wasn't just a briefing. It was an actual opinion piece of his that, bad luck is about, Jackson being injured, Guiu being injured. And he referenced, obviously, Arsenal having their recent injury to Kai Havertz. Now, having 2 strikers go down at the same time is unfortunate. It is, right? Like, you cannot plan for that. You cannot anticipate that. Like, or what I mean by that is you can't. That sometimes that just happens, right? And that is going to be a big blow to any squad, even well-assembled squads. I think back to better Chelsea days when, like, if Costa was obviously injured, but if Costa, Remy and Hazard went down at the same time during that 14-15 season, Chelsea under Mourinho would have some serious issues, especially if you have all your best players go down at the same time. However, I don't think this sporting director regime, this club, has a lot of leeway on that anymore, because they've had over 5 windows to sort out the striker situation and to at the very least offer another option at centre forward. The injury situation in midfield with Romeo Lavia and now in striker, I think only exposes a problem. It isn't the source of the problem. It's not like Chelsea's squad building was absolutely fine until we got these injuries. I think I would, and maybe others would, be a lot more accepting if we had seriously signed a centre-forward option in the summer or in recent transfer windows, if our midfield depth was a lot stronger, if we had a competent goalkeeper. All of these things, I think, would add up to create an environment where people will be a lot more sympathetic to those injury problems. A little bit like how they were under Thomas Tuchel, right? When you think back to when Reece James and Ben Chilwell both went down injured in the space of a couple of weeks and our season, really derailed. Yes, at the time, I think a lot of our frustration was that the backups and the squad profiling wasn't that good. But I think there was a lot more sympathy now, where it feels like our decision-making is so boneheaded that, you see it coming a mile away. And when it actually, the worst situation does occur, when Jackson, who's already been run into the ground already, I don't think people have a lot of sympathy, and I understand that. So in terms of tonight's game, Brighton under Fabian Hurtzler haven't been that great. They started the season well, then they met Chelsea, they lost. They've kind of gone back and forth. They've had some big wins during the season, but I think they've also been really isolated and exposed defensively. The worst thing was a week before we played Brighton in the FA Cup, they were obviously absolutely demolished by Nottingham Forest 7-0. And I still think from a tactical point of view, there's a lot that Chelsea should be doing against this Brighton team. I think they leave themselves far too open in transition. They push their fullbacks up really, really high, which means there is space to counter run. And Chelsea looked like they were going to expose that very early on in the first half of the FA Cup game. I'd like to see a lot more of that. The unfortunate thing is, I think in Chelsea's performances at the moment, because we've seen so many similar ones, it doesn't kind of feel relevant to talk about the opponent all the time, because we've seen similar flaws against a variety of different quality opposition. So you're kind of looking more at what Maresca's doing, what the team's doing, different tweaks that could be made and different personnel that could come in. But unfortunately as well, with the current moment, a lot of personnel are underperforming, and because the squad depth and quality of it isn't that great, you kind of are left in a difficult situation, because even when you do rotate some of the players coming in, you're kind of like, well, they haven't exactly been setting the world alight recently. So let's get to my starting 11. My starting 11 is, I think it's pretty obvious, but I do think there are obviously some key decisions to be made. Jorgensen in goal. I'll say this, and I think it can be said in other areas, but Maresca in some ways gets shielded, and I think rightly so, in the sense that, the responsibility lies above him. It absolutely lies above him for what's gone wrong at Chelsea. No doubt about that. I think it's just intellectually dishonest to try and sit here and to say that Enzo Maresca is the biggest problem at Chelsea currently, and if you took Enzo Maresca out of the current situation, it's going to radically improve. I think you're missing reality. But as a coach, he still, we assume, has some ability to pick the first team. I'd be really, really concerned. I mean, there is some suggestion that maybe in certain areas he isn't exactly in terms of squad building, but I believe he does have an ability to pick the team. He was someone who stuck with Robert Sanchez for a far too long a period of time, and that cost him. If he decides to start Robert Sanchez and the game goes badly again, I just sit here and go, I don't know what the defence for Enzo Maresca is, because at some point, unless literally he has no accountability or literally he has no responsibility in picking the team, what is he doing there in the first place? So I think, listen, he has to pick Philip Jorgensen. Jorgensen might not be brilliant, but if he can just be a safe pair of hands or just steady, that will be better. We know Reece James was rested. I feared that we were going to get a really bad injury update. Luckily, that isn't the case, and Reece is ready, so he needs to start tonight. The back two, I think, is a very difficult one in the sense that, The defence hasn't been performing well. Tosin's had some shaky moments. Chalobah had a shaky moment against Brighton last week. Levi hasn't performed well for a long period of time. And obviously the lack of depth in terms of injuries to Fofana and Badiashile, creates further headaches there because you don't have obvious players to come in. Josh Achimpong, I think, should be getting more minutes. I think he should be used a lot more, whether that be at centre-back or at right-back. Because that right back area has been troublesome for some time. I actually think from what we saw with Josh Achimpong, I thought there was a lot to like about his performances, and I didn't like the way he was hooked at Bournemouth by Maresca, and I don't think we've seen him since, which I think is problematic. Like, I don't think it's right that not only was he isolated and hooked in that moment, but he hasn't been used at all since, really. Like, I wouldn't mind seeing him in the back two tonight. I really wouldn't, because you can't seriously argue that the other options have been so significantly greater. I do think, though, that for this game, Chalobah at right centre-back, I think, has been the strongest recently. And Levi Colwill, I think, will come back into the team. Levi desperately needs a strong performance. I think because of his passing especially, I think if he starts to click back into gear, because I do think eventually he will click back into gear as a young defender, I think that Chelsea will look a much better team overall, because I think his ability on the ball, I think, helps us further up the pitch. But defensively, he needs to be a lot more rigid, a lot more authoritative when a ball comes over the top and he needs to go one-on-one with an opposing attacker. Like, I just don't think he's asserted himself as well as he should, and he's made some really stupid decisions. And we saw it last season where he just loses concentration inside the box too much for me. He needs to elevate that part of his game if he wants to get back to being a guaranteed number one first choice for Enzo Maresca. Cucurella obviously at left back. Midfield, who else is it going to be other than Enzo Fernandez and Moises Caicedo? The three behind the striker. So I think that Noni Madueke, I think, will start on the right again. He's the most productive of our wide players. I think that's why he keeps playing and probably should keep playing. Neto's done nothing really for a long period of time. He scored in the West Ham game, but again, a bulk of games now, like he didn't perform well against Brighton last week. Left side, I don't think Sancho has been brilliant, and I have to say it's another one of these situations a bit like Achimpong, where if I see Tyreek George start, I have to say I wouldn't mind seeing Tyreek George start this game. What's the counter argument here? That there is a wide player out there in our current team that is so significantly better. Sancho has barely done anything recently. Neto hasn't performed. Even Madueke's had some really poor performances. I don't think it's wrong for Maresca needs to find solutions in this current moment. And a point that Louis made on our podcast that I think is a relevant one. We have a lot of wide players that want the ball to feet, not enough who make runs off the ball behind the defence. Is that an instruction by the coach? Maybe, and that's a problem. But I do think that Tyreek George, as kind of a raw player, someone who I think will take chances as a young kind of dynamic, a little bit of a maverick. I think that's what this team needs currently. It needs something to get out of its slumber. It needs someone to break the mold a little bit. And I think that Tyreek George maybe deserves that opportunity, because there's no more Felix. We don't know what's going on with Mykhailo Mudryk. So for me, let's start Tyreek George and see what happens. I think it's the time to do it, because the other options have failed to solidify themselves in the starting 11. So then we get into this number 9, number 10. I think the obvious answer here is that Cole Palmer starts as number 9. I think it's as simple as he's our best finisher, he is our best creator, he's our best player. He's our best player in front of goal. He's our most effective player in front of goal. He is the player you want chances to fall to 9 times out of 10, and sometimes 10 times out of 10, and he will finish them. I think that's the logic behind it. The similar logic behind this is that then it means that Nkunku can play a role more preferable to his skill set, which is kind of a number 10 / more kind of retracted forward, second striker, whatever you want to call it, but can still play in those central areas, because I think that is where you can get the best out of Christopher Nkunku. I think Nkunku at his best is as lethal a finisher as Palmer and can be a game changer for Chelsea. This is kind of a sliding doors moment, maybe a turn of a sequence of events that have meant that maybe, just maybe, this is the start of when Nkunku makes his Chelsea career happen. And sometimes you see that in football, right? Like coincidence and injuries and form all lead up to a perfect storm where a player's situation turns on its head. And maybe, just maybe, this is where Nkunku becomes a certified Chelsea starter. Now, it's not just a simple case of he plays in this role and everything comes to fruition, because undeniably, even with him playing in not his best role out wide or as number 9, his performances haven't been good enough. When he's got the ball, he hasn't impacted things well enough. He should have scored. He should have taken a shot in that first half against Brighton. That could have put Chelsea in front, and that game could have turned out differently. So there still needs to be player responsibility for all of these players, right? But I think that, Nkunku, if we see him in that role, I think him and Palmer floating around, I just think it's the obvious option currently. I think you try and get those players on the pitch. It's the first time you can probably get Palmer and Nkunku together and see if that relationship can build over a period of time, and hopefully it can. And I think with Palmer playing number 9, he has played there very briefly before, but because we know how good Palmer is and how instrumental he is, he kind of plays where he wants. Like, even if you play him at number 10, we know he can pop up, deeper. We know he'll move out wide. We'll know he'll move to the left, and we know he'll, be inside the box to potentially finish chances. I think those two will rotate naturally. But if you're asking me, who am I going to without a recognised number 9? I think it's going to be Cole Palmer. I think it's kind of one of those, like, putting your best player just in front of goal and just playing with the odds and saying, who do I want that chance to fall to? If we create chances, you want it to be Cole Palmer. I think as the focal point of our attack, it just makes more sense. And I also just think, as another point, he's our best presser. He's a significantly better presser than Nkunku. Obviously, that's one of Nkunku's weaker points. So I think that helps as well. And maybe aerially can be a little bit more impactful as well. So that is my starting 11. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I do think this is a must-win game for Chelsea. I think even a draw is not really going to suffice at the moment. It's not going to change the mood that well. Chelsea just need to win, and it would be their first win away. I think it's Astana, which is mad, absolutely mad, but reflects how bad this run has been. No one result is going to turn around everything at Chelsea. It can't. But given that we're in a stage of the season now where it really is now put up or shut up time for Chelsea in terms of Champions League qualification, which is still within their grasp and still basically within their control, it's now time for the team to step up. And I think more so if we look at Enzo Maresca, who does have, problems above him, problems below him. But this is where I think as a coach, he can prove that he is adaptable, he's flexible, he can survive and thrive in difficult circumstances. I think this is where we're going to learn a lot, probably more so than any other period in the season, about Maresca as a coach. At this time last year, Pochettino was under a lot of pressure, and we just lost to Wolves in the Premier League, and he was under a lot of scrutiny. And we had a replay against Aston Villa in the FA Cup, and of course it turned out to be a big win. And then, as people pointed out, the form from there to the end of the season, I think we lost once in the league, which was that terrible Arsenal game, and the FA Cup semi-final against Man City. So if Maresca can do something similar, I think Chelsea will get Champions League football. It's whether he can replicate what Poch did, basically, and prove a good enough coach to adapt to the circumstances to find creative solutions in this difficult moment. We will begin to find out tonight. So I'll be back later tonight to give you my review of the Brighton game. Let me know your thoughts. Have a great Valentine's Day if you're celebrating, a great Friday, and I will see you again very soon. All the best.